Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. This strange and unusual show that takes a different album each and every week, generates a discussion about it, and just finds out what's going on, or at least tries to. Sometimes, we just get thrown down these weird existential musical journeys, which, I think this review is definitely going to be in places like this one came out a little bit weird, but it's just where my mind went to when writing about it. So, in today's episode, we are returning to minimal resource manipulation, the strange experimental label run by one Matt Atkins, who uses the label as a wonderful outlet for some really bewildering musical experiments. So this review introduces an artist that I have wanted to discuss on the show for some time. I came across them as a result of this very album, and found myself delightfully confused and amazed by their discography of music, as I just kept coming across various releases by them when diving into many different experimental labels. I think starting at the beginning is a good place to begin. As this is a very drony and hypnotizing album, but it's one that's actually oddly emotive in places as well, which is really bizarre. So yes, without further ado, I present I Hill, Arm River by Tim Olive. So, of course, who is Tim Olive? Well, Tim Olive is an experimental musician from Moose Jaw, Canada, currently residing in Kobe, Japan, at least according to Discogs, whose work utilises magnetic pickups and simple analog technology to investigate, invoke, and amplify the inner voices of metal objects. So yes, a very odd, very unique approach to music composition, but Olive has made a true art of this approach essentially, resulting in this very wonderful discography of solo and collaborative albums that traverses such a wide spectrum of experimental releases, and just resulting in this fascinating discography of albums that span labels such as Chocolate Monk, Steep Gloss, the aforementioned minimal resource manipulation, and of course a favourite at Weird Music here, Falt Records, as well as many, many more, of course. And so yes, today we are diving into I Hill, Arm River, a 4-track album released on CD by Minimal Resource Manipulation. And yes, this odd enigmatic album, utilising Olive's odd approach to music, according to Bandcamp, generated sounds and tones using the following: tuning forks, magnetic resonator, blank cassette tape, tape loops, magnetic pickups, octave divider, spring reverb, and preamps. So yes, very bizarre, but every time I listen to a Tim Olive album, I just find myself just always fascinated by the odd occurrences embedded deep within the music that he creates. And on I Hill, Arm River, we're actually given such a weird enigmatic journey into some of the most unknowable worlds, it feels. Like, it's perhaps amongst some of the most incomprehensible music I think I've come across, but it's something I find to be truly delightful, and something I just really respond to for some reason. So yes, as mentioned, I've always wanted to cover the music of Tim Olive on the show before, found myself inspired to discuss one of my favourites here, so yes, let's dive into it, shall we? So opening up with EHAR 1, or I Hill, Arm River 1, we have sort of an unusual ambient vibe coming through the procedure of all of these weird effects that Tim Olive has put together. This gentle resonance of a tone that hovers in the air, immersing us in these odd oscillating drones that seem to stretch and warp our very perception of time and place, it feels. The very sound waves themselves, they feel very oddly organic, I have to say, like they're these living beings of sorts, shifting and morphing into the very gaps of space and time left behind by the music itself. It is very weird because it's so wholly experimental, such a result of putting together these odd disparate sorts of sound generation, the use of that tuning fork and the magnetic reverbs and pickups, resulting in generated sounds that just oscillate so wildly and delightfully. And what fascinates me, though, is how on the first composition, there's this odd emotional edge to how it's all coming across. Like, although born from all of these incredibly peculiar and disparate sources, what remains here is something that sounds, to me, very oddly melancholy and emotional. This weird sense of loneliness to the particulars of the music itself, this tragic sense of isolation, as though you just imagine sitting there alone, generating these incredibly weird alien soundscapes. Like, it's very odd, especially when it all just slowly develops and morphs the very loops themselves with those wonderful oscillations. And it even somehow finds room for these very delightful granular layers to slowly build up from the silence itself. The garbled noise of analog occurrences caught within this branch of experimentalism. Like, it's very weird and oddly impenetrable in terms of like the actual music side of things, but something that has always stood out to me within the vast discography of Tim Olive, or at least what I've heard thus far. Like, it is a very expansive discography. Like, it's weird because when it comes to his music, I get this odd sense of playfulness, of trickery and mischievousness as a result of all of those peculiar effects that Tim Olive puts together. And here on I Hill, Arm River, the same approach to experimentalism is there, but it results in something on the first track that feels oddly poignant, though, which is perhaps why it might be one of my favourites from both Minimal Resource Manipulation and Tim Olive himself. Very fascinating way to open up this whole album, and yeah, a truly wonderful, wonderful track. To move along, though, we then get on to Earhart 2, or I Hill, Arm River 2. So opening up with these really unusual frequencies that sing like rusty swing sets, echoing their high-pitched squeaks into the deluge of effects provided by Tim Olive. Following that more melancholic opener, the soundscape opts for something a little bit more foreboding here. Like the way the sounds slowly pulse out with their effects, swelling in place with these oddly lo-fi sound generations, that just come in, looping over and over as they threaten to introduce their own odd frequencies into that mix as well. And with how it comes across, it creates this odd cylindrical quality of everything slowly spinning at the bottom of some barrel. All that is happening is the constant stirring and stirring of everything, it feels. These subtle manipulations occurring as a result of keeping the whole thing slowly spinning around, essentially, resulting in a composition that really threatens to hypnotise you. It pulls you into the strange liminal space your mind offers. And I think with how oddly spacey this one is, though, it really gives me an impression of being slowly sucked into the picture featured in the album's artwork. This strange, unexplainable structure found on some walk in the middle of nowhere, it feels, whilst your warped perception envisions these odd tendrils stretching out across the very landscape itself. To be fair, it's also one of those things that's always drawn me towards this particular album, especially when first discovering Minimal Resource Manipulation, this very unusual artwork. This strange, enigmatic picture that asks more questions than it ultimately answers, I feel. Not quite helping to explain the enigmatic qualities of the music, but rather push it further into abstraction itself as you're just lulled further and further into this unusual image. But it is such an oddly enigmatic track, and it's one that keeps the odd fractured momentum going for the entirety of the composition, seemingly managing to introduce these really unusual metallic layers towards the end that seem to scrape with those magnetic effects. Metal brushed against metal and resonating in the very space itself with these wonderful tones. Very weird and unusual, and even when the frequencies border towards the unusual and unexplainable, it still comes across to me as being incredibly fascinating. Like, I just find the weird hypnotising quality of the track completely pulls me into that odd dreamscape the music has just been constantly suggesting, especially in consideration to the album's rather emotive opening track. Like, the navigation of this album across the 4 tracks as well, which we'll get to a bit later, is something that's always fascinated me. This enigmatic journey of these very unusual textures and tones and frequencies that creates for us this wonderful little sound odyssey. This journey into places that don't really seem to exist at all. Like, each journey into sound is something very weirdly unique, I have to say. With Olive, just conjuring up these very unexplainable places that feel both familiar and new at the same time. Like, it's like you're traversing through, unknown places that are all produced from your memories of small instances in various spots in the world that you have visited. Not the easiest thing to explain, but when it comes to odd experimental music like this, I always find it ends up sucking me into somewhere I haven't been before and sending my mind itself just down this weird avenue that is very difficult to put into words. But it's why I adore looking at albums like this, truth be told. Like, when it comes to any album from this sort of branch of experimental music, from minimal resource manipulation to any of the different labels that Tim Olive has released on, like, I adore checking out the various experimental albums because I never know what I'm going to get. But by having no expectation, I often find that the artists involved, and in this case Tim Olive of course, they end up composing music that makes me feel something very oddly different and unique for the most part. Like, I'll say here, it's interesting because certain aspects, especially in regards to this album, it feels oddly reminiscent of previous experiences of some sorts. But the way it's been presented in this particular form, it makes for something that is different within its own right in terms of how your emotions have been navigated across this journey. Really difficult to explain, and I think at this point I'm starting to actually confuse myself at this point, but what can you even do? So yeah, let's just move along. AR3, or I Hill Arm River 3, which at 8 minutes is our longest track here. So our third instance of these strange, unusual worlds. This once again manages to capture the very unique aspect of being both familiar and new, as mentioned in the previous track. There's a strange rising of wub electronic drones here, offset by the delightfully unusual frequencies that stretch across that landscape, pulling the emotions into something that feels oddly curious. Like this track, it feels like we're starting to see reality of what lies before us, the literal vision of this I Hill Arm River, the image presented to us on the album's cover. It's as though after journeying and traversing through so many unusual worlds, we have found ourselves in this oddly liminal space, feeling the very air itself expand before us as these unusual sounds pull themselves into that landscape. And especially how this one actually develops, slowly evolving to introduce these more unusual granular layers of subterfuge buried beneath the oscillating drones and frequencies that are battling against each other. It's like being witness to the generation of ambient rumbles from low-flying airplanes perhaps way off in the distance when you're in those open spaces. It's perhaps, there's such a sense of this odd growing or organic organism of sorts as well, bubbling under the surface as it stretches its unusual tendrils across your vision. It ends up dominating more of the scene, I should say, leaving behind those more abstract droning layers that opened up the whole album, and it offers something that ends up being so much more mysterious and unexplainable here. Like, it's so odd, as there is a drone occurring here for the most part, one that actually opts for this very delightful low end as well. But its presence actually feels very subtle and buried in amongst the miasma of those stretched out taps and collisions, resonating in the very space itself with those unusual frequencies and textures. It comes across to me as one of the more experimental tracks on this very album, utilising such delightful levels of lowercase and lo-fi to achieve something very peculiar and unusual. Something that seems to excavate and bury itself in amongst your very skin, it feels, Especially with how those higher end frequencies resonate with such clarity. It just ends up warping your very perception of time and place itself, it feels, And as though whilst we're on our little walk into the countryside, we've coincidentally come across the very structure in the middle of nowhere and just watched as it started growing these far-reaching black tendrils. Once again, akin to the image presented on the album's cover, which perhaps why it comes to mind so much, this rather vivid imagery of hallucination of sorts. It often occurs as a result of experimental music though, just to go back to it actually, especially with albums like this, it just adheres to no forms or conventions whatsoever. Just utilising the generation of sounds from all of Olive's unusual sources to create this odd blend of tones and textures, all blending together in this very unusual fashion. And each of the compositions, they just seem to drift across, sounding a little bit more psychedelic than the conventional experimental album, it feels. Most likely as a result of all of those droning layers that Tim Olive creates, actually. As mentioned, it's always been a favourite of mine from both Tim Olive and Minimal Resource Manipulation. And I think with just how Olive's music ends up resulting, in drones with such wonderfully unusual textures, it just results in something that I seem to respond to really well. It's why I actually enjoy listening to another album of his, Hindmost Hand, so much, which is Olive's release for the cassette label Molt Fluid, which I do own the physical copy for. On that particular album, the tonal generations, while using these same sort of magnetic pickups and string reverbs, it actually helps to generate sounds from using metals and electromagnets, and it results in an album that feels worlds apart from the more ambient sound generated here. Like, the textures in Hindmost Hand feel so phenomenally physical and metallic, droning away for such long periods of time. And it has been an album I've wanted to cover on the channel, but I just never got around to it. But I bring it up because it's just another example of Olive's unique approach to sound generation, resulting in these wonderfully unique sound journeys into the unknowable that are also different from each other. And here on I Hill Arm River, that same sort of approach, magnetic reverbs, spring reverbs, pickups and things like that, is resulting in something so delightfully experimental and a lot more ambient in places as well. Bit of a tangent, of course, but like I said, it's just what came to mind when listening to this particular song for some reason. And with it being the longest one at 8 minutes, it just seemed to really set my mind off, trying to cobble together an understanding of the music from what little I actually know of it, to be fair. At the end of the day, music like this won't ever truly make a lot of sense, and all I really have to go on is just my unusual enjoyment of it, which is why I love to present stuff like this on the show. Something about it fascinates me, which is why actually when it comes to any kind of album of this ilk, I try my best to cover it when my attention comes across it, for better or for worse. It's why I'm able to make the show the way it is. And for some reason, I just felt drawn to finally talking about Tim Olive for the first time, landing on I Hill Arm River, which I think is one of the most delightful excursions from this fascinating experimenter of sound. Anyway, it's perhaps best to move along and finish this episode before we really go off on a tangent that we can't come back from. So we do have one final track in the form of Air Half 4, or I Hill Arm River 4. And so this one opens up with a really thick resonating drone of sound, those magnetic pickups sending the tuning forks across these fascinating oscillations once more, further generating sounds as they get caught in the deluge of electronics. It feels like the aesthetics of this one is perhaps very reminiscent of the album's opening track, as though we're finally returning back the way we have come, away from the unusual monuments and back towards a reality that makes more sense to us. A weird concept, considering how this one seems to actually once again capture the existential loneliness once more, like that opening track. Like, you just get that sense of isolation once more, the kind of magic and intrigue, from the album's middle tracks, kind of all gone and disappeared as we turn ourselves back towards that reality. It's very strange, but I kind of adore how it kind of has that oddly emotional edge once more. Just capturing the resonating frequencies that perch themselves upon melancholy, it feels. Very strange, considering the journey that this album has literally taken us on across the different tracks, But I kind of adore the full circle effect that it has here, bringing us right back to the opening once more to close the whole thing off. Very fascinating, and just another oddly gorgeous composition in amongst this impenetrable experimental album. So yes, definitely a very odd album in a lot of respects. With 4 tracks, it's not a particularly long album, of course, is it? But it's one that packs a lot into its very brief runtime of sorts. From the emotive swells of those bookends to the album, to the fascinating experimentalism of the 2 middle tracks traversing from the tangible to the incomprehensible, it just results in one of the most fascinating experimental albums I think I've ever come across. I just adore the way in which Olive generates his sounds, and in particular consideration, how he then crafts them together into these very compositions that we have here today. And on I Hill Arm River, it results in something I find to be so rewarding. It's an album that reveals so many secrets and details the more you just sit down with it and dive into it, and allow for its strange incomprehensibility to just take control. I mean, of course, with music like this, you never know what truly is going on at any given time, of course, do you? But the way it keeps your mind guessing is just part of the delight in discovering music like this. Minimal resource manipulation. it's just another one of those labels I love diving into from time to time. The way in which curator Matt Atkins has, just gathered together such a wonderful roster of experimental musicians, it's resulted in a vast catalogue of so many wonderful experimental albums. And you get such a wide range of different experiences here, some enigmatic, some confusing, some that make absolutely no sense at all. But then the fact that I Hill Arm River seems to capture so many different aspects, from that aforementioned enigmatic confusion to even those rare moments of bewildering beauty, all as a result of just generating tones from the approach Tim Olive uses. I marvel in how much this album has navigated across the entire experience, Even moments that feel so oddly emotive, even though it's just the occurrence of generated tones oscillating wildly. It just seems to capture something deep within my very being, making it an album I find so oddly rewarding, and without a doubt one of my favourite things from the label and from Tim Olive, of course, isn't it? Definitely a weird one, and not one that I think is going to make a lot of sense to viewers, I'll say. But then again, that has never been important to me in terms of making content for this show. Part of this show is generally just about capturing my odd fascination with unusual independent experimental music. The kind of things not a lot of people maybe have on their radar, perhaps. But it's not that I've ever cared, to be honest. I think part of it is just that I love to listen to and discover new and different music. And thus I'm always listening to different things across my life, essentially. And at some point, as a result of actually purchasing all of Minimal Resource and Manipulation's discography, I came across the work of Tim Olive, who's another one of those artists whose names just kept cropping up on the many different independent labels scattered in amongst this branch of experimental music. And after listening to I Hill Arm River, I found myself fascinated by his unique approach to music, with this one being an album that captured both my curiosity and my interest. And with experimental music, within it just feels so oddly rewarding, especially in this case when it starts off so distinctly drony before navigating unusual levels of hypnotizing experimentalism, before going right back into drones again with that sort of bookended quality that we've mentioned. It's resulted in an album, that if you play it back to front constantly, it results in a very perfectly circular experience, I feel. An album that goes around forever and forever for however long you want to occupy it for. Hence why I find it oddly rewarding. As you find such odd moments of clarity within each and every listen, and then odd moments of hypnotizing confusion that you have no idea what's going on about. It's so odd, I do know for some reason, it's one I like and definitely a favourite of mine within experimental music, so yeah, wonderful stuff. And so yes, I think with that we'd probably better come to the end of our episode of Weird Music. Another weird one to have tried to dive into, and I think it really sort of set my brain down this kind of confusion of incomprehensibility and trying to express it in this tangible way. And I don't think it's come across very well at all, but I just feel it's best to run with whatever albums I listen to capture my curiosity and interest at the time, or at any given time. It certainly has allowed for this show to talk about a wide range of different albums as well. But yes, I am glad to have finally presented Tim Olive on the show, as well as returning to Minimal Resource Manipulation. I have been meaning to return to this label, and for some reason I just landed on this one. And I'm glad I did, as this kind of thing I just really enjoy for some reason. Very weird, but I think it's really neat in its own right, isn't it? So yeah, if you've made it this far, then I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. What else should I check out from the scene, from these dudes? Bit of an open-ended question, so don't worry, most people don't answer the questions anyway. Regardless of that though, I'd like to thank you for watching this episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.